Stephen Chang, who's a Chinese doctor and who comes from a long line of doctors, once said that the three keys to good health are good nutrition, exercise, and forgiveness. It kind of caught us by surprise. What do you think about that idea?
Oh, well, you really raised a question that's very close to my heart, Charlie. As I heard that quote just now, I suddenly remembered a story that isn't very happy, but I think I'll tell it anyway. A friend of mine, a close friend, once called me in a very desperate state. She said that she had found out that her husband of 20-odd years was in love with his secretary, and it had been a fairly long-term thing about which she knew nothing. And she wanted to know what she could do. Well, I met her for lunch, and she was bitter. She was furious. She was angry, as of course would be considered natural.
Mm-hmm.
A few months later, she still was. And a few months later, she still was. And one day she asked me to meet her, and she said, I know you believe in forgiveness as an ongoing process in healthy living, but she said, I just can't do it. And I said, do you think you could find it in your heart to see him as he always was with you, loving, kind, considerate, tender, a good father? She said, no, he wiped out all those happy thoughts from my mind. I said, well, if you thought you could have the help of your higher self, knowing she believed in those things, would you ask for it? She said, no, I'd rather see him rot first. And a year later, she had died of cancer.
If forgiveness is so good for us, why is it so difficult?
Actually, it isn't difficult. The difficult part of it, as I find it, Charlie, and as I say, as I find it, it sounds as if this is new. Coming from me, it's not. I think this is sort of age-old and accepted by many people who delve into these ideas. But my particular process of study is A Course in Miracles, so I'll be quoting that a lot. The way I see it through A Course in Miracles is that we have a misperception of what forgiveness is. We think that, well, I really should forgive her because I'm really a bit better than she is, and she doesn't know much, and although she's hurt me a lot, I can always look past that and be nice to her. That's not seeing the other individual as equal to me. That's not seeing the spirit in someone else. That's seeing the form of what she is and what I think she's done. A Course in Miracles defines forgiveness in a very different light. It's based upon a spiritual reality which we all share, not the physical. Of course, in this world we call our life, we see a lot of mistakes. We see a lot of sadness and pain. We see death. And we see people doing funny things to each other. And they're not very nice. But if we recognize in truth, if we're just willing to recognize that we have within us that which knows, a part of ourself that is still connected to our Creator and to each other, we can always turn to that at any time and say, show me how to see this. I cannot do it of myself. I know that we are very resistant to do this. Number one, we're afraid it won't work. Number two, many times we want to be angry. We want to be unforgiving. It's the way we know best. But if we dare to say, I have a problem and I cannot resolve this myself, please, that which in which I believe, we call it God, we call it higher self, we call it spirit, infinite love, whatever, please help me do this. Something will happen, another way of seeing. As soon as we release the complete control of an unforgiving mind, we get the help that we need. And there is a shift in perception, and we suddenly see resolution.
How important is the concept of selflessness in forgiveness? Is it important to give up yourself, or can you go into the process of forgiveness and say, I know I'm going to feel better if I forgive this person, therefore, in a rather selfish way, I'm going to forgive them so that I get something good out of it?
I think that if we want to look at it that way, it's probably a help, and most people would probably choose that first. But when we talk about the self, I raise the question, which self are we talking about? I think we see ourselves in duality. In that sense, there's a self with a small s, let's call it the ego, or the personality self. And then I think almost everybody trusts, or at least has a slight belief in, that self which we call the capital S, or the higher self within. So when you say selflessness, I think what you mean is suspend the ego's interpretation and side with the higher part of one's mind, that which knows better and wants to extend only in love. In that case, we're really following the laws of how we've been created. And I would call that a good way to be selfish with a capital S. I remember the first time I ever thought of these ideas, I had had a very bad day at my office. My partner, it seems, unbeknownst to me, had not been paying our withholding taxes to the few employees we had. And he was out of the office, I discovered in the books. And I was furious. I couldn't reach him. I came home. I threw the dinner on the table for my husband and my son and my daughter, muttering all the time. And my 7-year-old girl said to me, "Mommy, aren't you eating your dinner?" And I said, "You don't understand. I'm so furious at Alan, I can't eat a thing." And she said, "Mommy, does Alan know you're angry at him?" And I said, "No, not yet, but he will tomorrow." She said, "Mommy, I bet Alan's eating his dinner." And I thought about this a lot, Charlie. I realized that my anger, my unforgiveness, my judgment of him was not making me feel good. My mother mentioned to me when I was discussing the subject with her even a little while ago today, "Don't you remember, honey," she said, "when I was so angry at your ex-husband?" She said, "He never cared how I felt about him." She said, "I didn't even want to see him on the street, and it made it uncomfortable for me to talk about him with affection to my grandchildren." She said, "And one day I decided the whole thing was silly, and I baked him a cake, and I felt better ever since."
What about motivation? How critical is that in the positive benefit of forgiveness? Does it matter if you do it for yourself, or if you do it for your higher self, or if you do it for somebody else? If you forgive them, they'll feel better. Does it make any difference, just so long as the process of forgiveness goes forward?
You ask the best questions. I would say this. It really doesn't matter what the original intent is, as long as it is one in which you want to extend yourself in love rather than contract in fear. There's a line in A Course in Miracles I love. It says, "Show the slightest willingness, and 1,000 angels rush in to help." So if you have the slightest willingness, for whatever reason, to shift your perception from that of unforgiveness to one where you can actually see something beautiful in the other person, it's going to be beneficial for all. And it doesn't really matter why you've done it. I have a few short rules that might be helpful that I use, and I know it works for me, in the practice of forgiveness. Number one, I agree with you. It's not easy because we have that small self, or the ego, personality self, that really wants to hold on to control. It really doesn't want to think there's anything else that can help it. It also sometimes seems to thrive upon pain and thrive upon anger and makes fear its idol. So the first step I would recommend, if one wants truly to learn forgiveness and to practice it, would be to recognize you have a problem. Unless you bring the problem to light, unless you're willing to see that the problem is there, well, you can't take the first step. So you recognize you have a problem, and then you recognize that you haven't been able to resolve it yourself. You're not feeling good. Neither is the other person. But in some cases, the other person doesn't even know you're angry at them, so you're not feeling good. And you recognize you can't do it yourself. You turn to that within, give it a chance, show the slightest willingness, and say, "I have this problem, and I need help. Will you please help me resolve this?" So you suspend control, or let go, and trust. And the third step is extending yourself. You decide not to be contracted, that you will take the step towards seeing the other person differently and see what happens. And I've got an example of that really worked with me beautifully with my own father. I had seen him for many years of my life as controlling, domineering, critical, and judgmental. I felt I couldn't do anything right. I'm sure he didn't see himself that way, but that's the way I saw him. And one day, while I was talking to him about my son's applying to medical school, he insisted my son would never be accepted because his hair was too long and it was my fault. And I had not raised him well, and I hadn't disciplined him, and I had no control over him. And I was ready to attack back, because what do we do when we're attacked? We either defend ourselves or we attack back. And he's a lawyer, and he had taught me offense is the best defense. So I was raring to go at him, when all of a sudden I remembered that I was studying A Course in Miracles, and my lesson for that day was about forgiveness. So for an instant I stopped my mouth from reacting, and in my mind, in my mind's eye, you could say, I saw that I wanted to see the situation differently, and I said nothing. A Course in Miracles says forgiveness is a quiet thing. It stands by silently and does nothing. So I did nothing, and he went on talking and talking, and all of a sudden I realized I could ask for a miracle. And in my heart I said, I would like to see this differently, and I need a miracle in order to do it. And suddenly I heard him, even though his voice didn't say these words, I heard from his heart that he wasn't attacking me. He was fearful about his grandson not getting what he wanted. And the only way he knew how to express that fear was to attack. And he was doing it not specifically at me, but because he couldn't control. And all of a sudden, 45 years of relationship vanished. And the welling up of love I felt for him was so intense I almost cried. I did nothing. Later on in the evening, as I was saying goodbye to him and to my mother, I put my arms around him and just gave him the regular kiss goodbye. And he suddenly looked into my eyes, and for the first time he said to me, "This was the nicest evening I ever spent in my life. Let's do this more often." And I was stunned, but I realized that that simple shift in my own mind, in my own heart, my asking for the miracle, realizing I couldn't accomplish it myself, allowing to let go of my former perception of him, it had transferred to him. And our relationship was amazingly different after that.
Which leads to the question, how important is the mouth in the process of forgiveness? And the example is, you've done something, I'm hurt, whether you meant it or not, I'm hurt by it, and you say, "I'm sorry," and I say, "Well, that's okay. My mouth says it. My heart still is hurt, and I may even be angry, but I can't fess up to it right now. I don't want to really deal with it, so I take the quiet approach."
Okay. We're in a process here that we have taught ourselves year after year after year, day after day, second after second, called judgment. And it's very difficult for us to just stop cold. Some people perhaps can, but I'd say most of us can't. William James, the famous doctor, philosopher, psychical researcher, beloved by many people who study his works, had something to say about this that I like to practice. And it says, "Act as if, and you will become." So if you know in your heart you would like to see it differently, but that person really has done something that you feel is hurtful, and you are not magnanimous enough yet to totally forgive, and the process hasn't really taken hold on you because you're a new student of forgiveness, say the things you want to believe. You're not being hypocritical. You want to believe them, but you just don't quite yet. So I act as if until it finally happens, and I find that works too.
So that process might involve saying, "It's okay, I'm going to be all right, it really
Yes.
wasn't that bad."
Yes, it could.
Even though the words are not really connected to your heart.
That's right, it could. Something else that I'm reminded in the Course of Miracles is that we have to bring our fears to the light. Repressing and denying isn't helpful, but we don't have to dwell upon them. It says what happens when you bring darkness to the light. It vanishes. So you bring your fears to the surface. If you even want to or feel you need to tell the other person how you feel, that's fine. And sometimes it clears the air, and sometimes it's just what the other person needs. But when you're finished with that, there comes a time when it's time to stop it and to say, well, I've said everything I have to say, and I want to feel differently about you and about me right now. So I'm not going to say any more. And that's a way, perhaps, of preserving what you think of as your integrity and moving towards forgiveness.
What about the individual who, having a difficult time with forgiveness and having been hurt and or disappointed by other individuals, goes into the cocoon of, I'm not going to put myself in a position where I can be hurt. Therefore, I don't have to deal with forgiveness. I don't have to forgive anyone because no one can hurt me.
I think a lot of us do that. We feel so hurt and so victimized by the world that we don't want to be touched by it anymore. And yet we know that that's a denial and a repression as strong as perhaps we can get. There are people in hospitals because of removing themselves from the world that they see. I think to help a person like that, sometimes skilled professionals are available. Sometimes a good friend who isn't judging the person's retreat, but rather can demonstrate a lovingness so strong that the person will feel loved by someone else. I know that times we all get in that frame of mind. We sink into a depression. Sometimes we don't even know why. It isn't even something going wrong at the office or someone we love hurting us. We just sink into a depression. The best thing to do is to pick up the telephone and call someone, anyone, and say, I love you. It's amazing how it lifts your spirits and how it brings you back again in touch with what is true, which is that nature in yourself, which is spirit. There are people, though, as you say, who get so caught up in their defenses and so completely insulated and isolated from the world that if that happens to be you or you have anyone like that in your family, I would say professional help then is necessary.
What can the individual do who doesn't get a chance to forgive? And I think that's a very common situation where you have a problem with someone and you don't get the problem resolved, and that other individual dies or moves away or goes away and is out of your life. And by the time you come around to being prepared to hand out the forgiveness, they're no longer there. So you really don't ever come to grips with it. It destroys some people, doesn't it?
It could if they think that that's what's happened. But there's another way of looking at it. And I would say, as pragmatically as possible, that we're not talking cliches here. We're talking about tools for change. If we're learning because we want to change. What is it we want to change to? If we want to be more peaceful, if we want to be more loving, if we want to be not conflicted, if we would like to be what we truly are behind what we've made of ourselves, then we're going to recognize that we have the option of doing something, and that is learning to forgive. Now, what happens when your mother, your father, somebody close to you, a friend dies, and you haven't told them you love them? You haven't said, I forgive you for having done such and such to me. I never really wanted to hold it against you. Or you haven't just plain expressed a friendship. If we truly want to believe, I say want to because I know many people who think about this sometimes say, I want to believe it, but I don't believe it yet. But if we truly want to believe that there's something greater than ourselves, something that connects us all irrevocably as one, something that is behind the physical world that we see, that is gentle and loving, extending and kind, let's say our better nature, then we are going to start to learn that that does not, space and time in the physical world as it's made, does not limit that. And I've been told many times by people who start to get the hang of the forgiveness process that, my goodness, my mother died before I was able to tell her that I didn't hate her for everything she did to me when I was growing up. And now I realize that I am not separate from her. And sometimes people will have dreams that seem so real with that individual as close to them as when the person was in life, acknowledging that that connection is there and that it is finally a true one. In other words, that forgiveness has been accomplished. If we have a few seconds, I'll tell you a quick story about that happened to me. And it wasn't somebody dying, because I'm trying to handle that before anyone does in my life.
Okay.
But rather, it was my son's hair. I mentioned my son's hair before. This goes back years. I hope he's not listening. Please, Jonathan, forgive me. He is a doctor now, and his hair is still long. But it was in the days when people had stopped wearing long hair, and his was still down the middle of his back. And he would come home from college, and I found myself, although I never said a word to him, I never criticized it, my teeth were on edge. I just didn't want to see it. It was sloppy. Everyone else was looking neat. Why was he doing this to me? He always said he would never cut his hair as long as he lived. He didn't want to. It would make him feel like Samson. He just wanted to feel his hair was what he wanted it to be. And one day I thought, my goodness, he's coming home for vacation next week, and I truly don't want to see my own beloved son. And I said, this is ridiculous. And I started doing exercises. I'd look at myself in the mirror and say, I do not care about his hair. I did it for 4 or 5 days. I really didn't mean it, because I still did care. But around the 5th day of doing it, I suddenly realized how important he was to me, what a good person he was, how helpful to others, how handsome he was, and how I really adored him. He came home a few days later. He walked in the door with a friend. He said, hi, Mom. I said, hi, Jonathan. And we hugged and kissed, and it was a good 3 seconds before I realized his hair was cut. At the dinner table that night, another friend who had joined him and hadn't seen his cut hair said, I thought, Jonathan, you said you were never going to cut your hair as long as you lived. And he said, well, I changed my mind. And the friend said, what made you change your mind? And he just shrugged over his shoulder, sort of gesticulating at me, and he said, she stopped bugging me. I had never said a word. Minds are connected, Charlie. If we dare to believe it, we get the proof so we know it.
Do you recommend the technique with the mirror to people?
Oh, I do, if that's what they want to do. You know, some people just don't like looking at themselves. And some people look at themselves every time they brush their teeth. Some people, really look at themselves. I think that when a person feels really not good about himself or herself, which means, 99% of us, I would recommend, since it works for me, to look deep into the eyes. Don't look at the face. Don't look at the way you're wearing your clothes. Look into the eyes and just try to see the love that's in there. It's much easier to see it in someone else's. But if you can start to see it in your own, you'll start feeling so much better about yourself. And you know what? You'll be healthier too.
If we can assume that forgiveness is a very positive potion, why is it so? Why does forgiveness work?
Well, my belief is, no, I take that back, my knowledge is. Someone once asked Carl Jung when he was an old man whether or not he believed in God when he was a little boy, and he said, yes, he did. Oh, well, now you've contributed so much to the study and the knowledge of the human mind. Can we ask you that question now? Do you still believe in God? And he thought for a moment, and he said, no, now I know. Well, I say, now I know that forgiveness works in one's life because the mind is all-powerful. We make the world we see by our thoughts. We choose what we believe, and we project it out there. A simple example, if this is just too much for somebody, is you get up in the morning and you feel rotten. It's a cloudy day, everything's going wrong, you go to work, you scream at the person sitting next to you on the bus for treading on your toes, your boss yells at you, all the people in the office are nasty, and you go home, and this is a rotten world. The next day you get up, the sun is shining, you put on your newest suit or dress, and off you go to the office and you smile at everyone along the way. You have a wonderful day. What's happened? Nothing. It starts in your mind. You have projected everything you see out there. That's your perception, your choice. If we choose to see differently, and forgiveness is a choice that we make, if we choose to see differently, we shall see differently. And I think that's the power of it. When we recognize how powerful is that mind of ours, and that we could be making choices for peace instead of for war, for love instead of for fear, we start to feel this wonderful uplift. I have power after all, and it's the power for good. That's the power of change, and I call it transformation.
If I have a wonderful day or a series of wonderful days and weeks and months and years, am I missing something by not being able to exercise forgiveness?
I think if you are having a sequence like that in your life, you are practicing forgiveness. And probably you don't know it. Sometimes when you give something a name, a symbol, a label, it becomes outside yourself rather than inside. We have a man in our neighborhood in Belvedere who is called Mr. Belvedere. I can even mention his name, is Dr. Sam Mann. And he once told me that there isn't a person he doesn't love. And do you know everyone loves him? He is the most upbeat, happy, outgoing, helpful individual, a retired man who is there as a community servant, and I have never in my life met anyone as happy as he is. That man breathes and lives forgiveness.
Is it ever appropriate not to forgive?
Never.
No circumstances?
None whatsoever.
All kinds of atrocities?
Oh, we're going to get into Nazi Germany? See, if I'm talking about forgiveness as a shift in perception, it doesn't mean you condone what the personality self or the egos do to each other. No way. It means that you want to see those atrocities in a different light. I think that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the doctor who was so important in establishing ideas that were helpful in looking at death and dying, put it very well when she said that she stood in a Nazi concentration camp after the war as a Swiss young medical student and thought to herself, the horror of this is so impossible to contemplate that my life is changed by this. I am going to dedicate my life in some way to see that I as an individual will be helpful in not letting this ever happen again. And she said, you can say that Hitler was the worst atrocity the world has known, but in a sense he was my inspiration.
Something good of everything, the silver lining in the dark cloud?
It's a shift in perception. It's not as trite as the silver lining in the dark cloud. If we want to use that expression, let's look and see what we really mean. The dark cloud is our ego. The silver lining is our spirit.
How can we apply these principles beyond the individual level? Corporations, governments, countries?
Well, let's take an example I think almost everybody knows. There was a time when Israel and Egypt were such mortal enemies that Egypt was dedicated to wiping Israel off the face of the earth, and Israel was determined to defend itself. And then a president, Jimmy Carter, decided that this was not healthy for the rest of the world. And of course not for the Egyptians and Israelis, but it would affect all of us because we do live on a planet which is interdependent. And he actually asked various community leaders to pray. He asked groups that would reach out to many, many others all over the world to pray on this as he invited these two heads of state, who wouldn't even look at each other, let alone speak to each other, to come to Camp David. I know the journalists were very cynical about this and didn't hold much hope out. But if you were watching television at the end of the time that was spent at Camp David and saw two men who were ancient enemies sign a peace treaty and then spontaneously embrace, you would be thrilled as I was. At that moment, a line from A Course in Miracles just emblazoned itself clear across my eyes, and I just quivered with happiness because the line was, "There is no place on earth more hallowed than that on which an ancient enemy becomes a present love." It works societally. That was forgiveness. They looked past what had happened in the past. They allowed celestial amnesia to take over. They dared to extend themselves in trust to each other. And who knows but that the history of the world wasn't changed that moment.
Is there an application that you can think of on a little bit smaller scale than the global national perspective that has maybe group application? Families. Let's take a neighborhood and two families that have lived next door.
Oh, of course. Years. All it takes is one. Romeo and Juliet. All it takes is one in that family to decide that he or she wants to see differently. All it takes is one. I guess going to the symbol that we think of the most, I brought up Romeo and Juliet already. After the two lovers died, their families got to be good friends. Doesn't it always happen that way? It's possible to have situations of conflict transformed into situations of peace when one human being, one mind, takes the responsibility for recognizing that it can happen. And we're fond of saying you can't fight City Hall or one person doesn't make a difference. But in this day and age, I think we know better.
When everyone in the world begins practicing forgiveness, what kind of a world will it be?
I'd love to answer that question, if you'll indulge me, with just a quote from A Course in Miracles, which I think expresses it much better than I could. It goes like this. What could you want forgiveness cannot give? Do you want peace? Forgiveness offers it. Do you want happiness, a quiet mind, a certainty of purpose, and a sense of worth and beauty that transcends the world? Do you want care and safety and the warmth of sure protection always? Do you want a quietness that cannot be disturbed, a gentleness that never can be hurt, a deep abiding comfort, and a rest so perfect it can never be upset? Here is the answer. Would you stand outside while all of heaven waits for you within? Forgive and be forgiven. As you give, you will receive. There is no plan but this for the salvation of the world. Let us today rejoice that it is so, for here we have an answer clear and plain, beyond deceit in its simplicity. All the complexities the world has spun of fragile cobwebs disappear before the power and the majesty of this extremely simple statement of the truth. If all the world practiced forgiveness, we would be in heaven.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.